In 1906, in a glittering New York hall filled with the sons of America's richest families, a young man from a remote Zulu village walked up to the podium and calmly tore their future to pieces. He didn't shout. He didn't beg. He simply described an Africa that did not yet exist, free, united, unbroken. And when he finished, the judges gave him their highest prize, while his closest rival, a blue-eyed star of the debating society, stared at him as if history itself had just betrayed him. But that triumph, that famous speech, was only the echo of a much harsher battle. Because before Pixley Isaka Seme could defeat his rivals on a New York stage, he had to survive a far more dangerous race. A race against poverty, against empire, and against time itself. And it all begins in a place where no one in that hall believed greatness could possibly be born. Imagine the hills of Natal in the 1880s. Morning mist clings to the grass. Cattle move like shadows. In a small homestead, a boy wakes up before the sun. His name is Pixley, and his world is already split in two. On one side, the rhythm of his ancestors, cattle, crops, songs by the fire, stories of kings like Shaka and Cetshwayo. On the other side, the cold paperwork of an empire, tax collectors, passes, unfamiliar English words that decide who owns the land his family walks on. Pixley Isaka Seme is born into that fault line. He grows up with the taste of dust in his mouth and the sound of marching boots in his ears. A child of a people who have seen their kingdom crushed, their lands surveyed, their lives measured in coins they never asked to use. As a boy, he herds cattle, barefoot, a stick in his hand, watching the horizon the way older men watch the market. He hears the elders speak in low voices about new laws, new boundaries, new humiliations. He doesn't understand every detail, but he understands one thing very clearly. The white man's paper is more powerful than any spear. One afternoon, a missionary visits the area. Neat clothes, Bible in hand, a notebook full of strange letters. He speaks of salvation. But the adults also hear something else. Schooling, reading, the mysterious knowledge that moves officials and judges. Most shrug. School means fees. Fees means selling cattle. Selling cattle means risking survival. For Pixley, though, those ink marks on paper are like a door left slightly open. He cannot stop staring. The first twist in his life is cruel. A bad season ruins crops. Cattle fall ill. The family is forced to count everything they own, not in pride, but in desperation. When the topic of school comes up, it sounds almost absurd. How can they send a boy to class when there is work to be done, when taxes loom like thunderstorms over the homestead? Yet, in the middle of this, someone, a parent, an uncle, an elder, makes a decision that will shift the course of South African history. Pixley will go, not because it is easy, but because it is dangerous not to. They give him something more terrifying than poverty. A deadline. You have one chance, the adults say without saying it. Go, learn fast, make this sacrifice worth it. If you fail, we may never afford to try again. So, the race begins. At the mission school, young Pixley walks into a classroom that smells of chalk and dust, and already the competition is waiting for him. In the front row sits a boy from a slightly wealthier African family, already praised by the teacher. Near the window, occasionally visiting, a pale, confident teenager, the son of a local white official, sometimes attends lessons, just to practice his preaching. These are Pixley's first rivals. Long before New York, they speak more English. They own more clothes. They do not arrive in class with the weight of a family's last coins on their shoulders. Pixley sits at the back, at first quiet, watching, listening. The letters on the blackboard look like a new kind of spear, and he intends to master them. He studies like a person running out of time, Every term is a cliff edge. If his results slip, will the fees still be paid? Will the family decide that one more season without his full labor is too much? He knows boys who vanish from the classroom mid-year, pulled back to the fields by necessity. He refuses to be one of them. Slowly, the positions shift. The teacher's favorite student finds himself matched, then overtaken, by the quiet herd boy who suddenly answers questions no one else can. The official's son discovers that the native boy he used to gently mock now meets his gaze in English, with a vocabulary sharpened like a new blade. Inside Pixley, something dangerous wakes up. The taste of victory. Not just survival, victory. But education in colonial Natal is never neutral. While he learns arithmetic and grammar, he also learns humiliation. He hears how Africans are described in certain books. Lazy, childlike, destined to be ruled. He sees the way white visitors pat the heads of the most gifted pupils as if they were clever pets. At night, back in the homestead, he listens to his people's stories, their praise poetry, their memories of a proud kingdom. The contrast burns. He begins to understand that he is not simply studying to save his family's land. He is studying to argue with an entire world. And yet the world he needs to argue with is far away. One day, a rumor reaches the mission. There are schools overseas, in America and in England, where a black boy can learn the very laws and ideas that white men use to rule Africa. The idea sounds insane. Cross the ocean, leave home entirely, become a stranger in a land of snow and skyscrapers. But for the missionaries and a small growing African elite, sending a few gifted young men abroad is a strategy, a gamble. One day, they might come back with the tools to fight the system from within. When Pixley's name is mentioned among those who might go, it feels like a second, impossible door opening. Behind it, however, is a larger, more merciless clock. If he goes, he will have a few short years. A few years to master languages, law, philosophy. A few years before the pressures at home, taxes, land dispossession, tightening laws, grow even worse. He cannot simply wander through foreign classrooms. He must treat every day as if his people are waiting on the other side of the ocean, counting. The journey to America is itself a shock. Picture a young man in a worn suit, clutching a small trunk, standing on the deck of a ship as waves slam against the hull. The sea air tastes of salt and iron. Around him, passengers talk in languages he barely understands. For the first time, he realizes how small his village is compared to the world, and how vast the world is compared to the arrogance of the men who claim to rule it. He arrives first at a preparatory school in the United States, far from home in climate and culture. Winters are brutal. Racism wears a different mask here, sometimes polite, sometimes violent, but always present. And yet, there is another difference. Here, theoretically, the law says all men are created equal, even if practice denies it. That gap between words and reality fascinates him. If an idea can be written on paper, perhaps it can be forced to come true. At school, and then at Columbia University in New York, the competition sharpens like a blade. Pixley now measures himself not just against a local favorite, but against the sons of American judges, businessmen, politicians. The lecture halls are filled with confident voices, trained in elite schools, sure that the world is theirs. He walks into these rooms as the African, the curiosity, the outsider. Some professors see potential, others see a stereotype. Fellow students switch between condescension and fascination. And again, a familiar pressure wraps around his chest. Time. Scholarships are not infinite. Money from home is fragile. Each semester, each exam, is another tightrope walk over an abyss. Among his classmates is a particularly charismatic rival, a young American orator beloved by the debating societies. Let's not give him a name here. history remembers him only as a type. He is the kind of man the system is built for. Assured, educated, white, rich. In every debate list, his name appears near the top. When contests are announced, his victory is taken for granted, until the day Pixley signs up. The night before their first major competition, while others rehearse with friends, Pixley studies alone in a small, cramped room lit by a single lamp. On his desk lie speeches of Lincoln, texts of philosophers, the Bible in English, and in Zulu rhythm inside his mind. He is not just trying to win points. He is trying to speak across oceans, to the elders by the fire, to the boys in Natal classrooms, to the officials holding pens over maps. His rival is preparing to impress the judges. Pixley is preparing to confront the century. There is a near failure. Overwork and the freezing New York winter catch him. He falls ill. For days, his body rebels. Fever blurs the edges of lectures and textbooks. In the haze, dark thoughts creep in. What if this is it? What if the money runs out? The grades drop. The people back home decide it was all a mistake. The deadline he carries in his head, finish fast, return strong, suddenly feels like a noose. The rival he thought most about, the confident American debater, almost fades in comparison to the rival stalking him from within. Exhaustion, doubt, the small, seductive voice that whispers, "It's too much," but he does not break. He bends, he coughs, he loses weight, and then slowly he stands again. When he returns to class, professors notice the change. The boy who once simply wanted to prove he belonged now speaks as if every argument is personal, because it is. By 1906, when Columbia announces a prestigious oratorical contest, the stage is set for the moment the world will later quote. The topic invites grand visions. Students across the university submit their speeches, sharpen their arguments, polish their phrases. Pixley chooses a subject that sounds to many almost laughable for a colonial subject: the future of Africa. He titles his speech, "The Regeneration of Africa." To skeptical ears, it sounds like fantasy. An Africa broken by conquest, cut into pieces on European maps, is to be reborn. On what evidence? With what army? Under whose permission? His rival chooses a safer topic, something grounded in American history, confident that judges will favor what they already know. Days before the contest, Pixley writes late into the night. Images of his homeland flood the page. Red earth, tall grass, royal drums, and beneath it all, a deeper rhythm. The capacity of a people to rise again. He weaves English rhetoric with the cadences of Zulu praise poetry. He turns his own life into a lens. The cattle boy who walked into the empire's schools and refused to bend his head. He writes as a man racing the clock. He knows he cannot stay in America forever. He knows that when he returns, he will face laws and guns, not just debates. If his speech fails here, in safety, what hope does his voice have later, in danger? The night of the contest, the hall glows with expectation. Young men in dark suits, professors in formal dress, the air filled with murmurs and the rustle of programs. Somewhere in the crowd, someone likely whispers, "He's the African, isn't he?" With that mixture of curiosity and condescension, his rival speaks first or second, commanding and polished. The audience nods. The judges note his points with professional satisfaction. It is good. It is expected. It is safe. Then Pixley Isaka Seme walks to the podium. When he begins, the room shifts. The judges expect a plea, perhaps an apology for Africa's backwardness. Instead, they hear a prophecy. He speaks of a continent not as a collection of colonies, but as a single living body, wounded but not dead. He describes its ancient civilizations, its philosophies, its dignity. He dares to suggest that Europe's moment of power is not eternal, that Africa will rise not in imitation of Europe, but in its own voice. He does what no one expects him to do. He treats Africa as the central character of the 20th century, not its victim. The words roll out, confident, measured, woven from Natal dust and New York discipline. His rival watches, stunned. This is not the exotic curiosity speech he expected. This is a challenge, and as the final sentences fall into the silence, the brighter day is rising upon Africa. The room, for a heartbeat, forgets the usual hierarchy of race and class. It is simply an audience witnessing something new. Then, the applause starts. When the judges announce that Pixley has won the highest oratorical prize, some are thrilled, some are offended, and many are simply shocked. A young black man from colonized Africa has not just competed with America's best, he has beaten them in their own arena, with their own language, on a subject they believed they understood better than he did. But for Pixley, the victory is not a comfortable crown. It is a heavier weight, because now he has publicly declared in front of the world that Africa will be reborn. The clock is still ticking. His people are still under the boot. And somewhere beyond the ocean, in a land that calls itself the Union of South Africa, a new system of laws and racial domination is being prepared. Soon, he will have to leave the safety of American lecture halls, pass through the colleges of Oxford and the Inns of Court in London, and finally return home, not as a boy chasing grades, but as a man walking into open conflict with an empire. For now, though, the ship back across the Atlantic waits in the future like a shadow on the water, and Pixley Isaka Seme stands at the edge of his student years, listening to the echo of his own words. If Africa is to rise, someone must carry that promise back into the lion's den. His rival in New York has been defeated. His real rival, the system that rules his homeland, has not yet even seen him coming. On the night New York crowned him its champion, telegram wires were already humming with news that would try to strip that crown from his head. While a hall of Americans applauded the regeneration of Africa, officials in distant offices were drafting something far colder, new plans to weld the colonies of the South into one white man's country, with Africans pressed to the edges like fingerprints on glass. One voice rising in New York, an entire system tightening its fist in South Africa. The applause faded. The clock started to roar. Pixley Isaka Seme did not go home immediately. First, he stepped into the very heart of the empire. Picture him walking under the grey skies of Oxford, books under his arm, the stone colleges leaning over him like rows of judges. The lawns are trimmed so perfectly they look unreal. The river glides politely past. It is beautiful, ordered, certain of its own importance. Here, young men train to administer an empire. Future governors, prime ministers, judges, they debate policy between sips of tea as if whole continents were chessboards. Among them moves a tall, dark-skinned student from Natal, quietly absorbing everything. The structure of laws, the unwritten rules. Of class, the way white power here is not just guns and flags, but habits and assumptions so deep they feel like nature. In lecture halls, a professor speaks of Roman law. Another dissects constitutions. Seme writes, underlines, memorizes. Each principle he learns is a tool he imagines one day turning back on the men who invented it. In those corridors, he attracts a new rival. Let us call him Arthur, because his real name does not matter. What matters is what he represents. Arthur is everything the imperial system loves. Blonde, polished, heir to a mining fortune in the Transvaal. He was born in Africa, but on the other side of the color line, in a house where African men enter through the back door and lower their eyes. Arthur recognizes Seme's accent the first time he hears him speak. "So you're from Natal?" he says, with an easy smile sharpened by entitlement. "Fascinating. My father has holdings there. Holdings, land, minds, lives. Arthur is not openly hostile. In some ways, that makes him more dangerous. He invites Seme to dinners, introduces him to friends as our African colleague, laughs at the right moments during debates, but under the politeness lies something colder. The certainty that when this is all over, Arthur will inherit a piece of South Africa, while Seme will be expected to fit himself into whatever narrow space white power allows. When they argue, and they argue often, it is usually about the same thing: the future of South Africa. Arthur insists that civilized natives can be protected by enlightened white policy if they are patient, loyal, grateful. Seme sees the mines, the whips, the dispossession when he closes his eyes. He has letters from home, written in careful ink and despair. He knows patience is not neutral. It is a battlefield where one side quietly bleeds. The time pressure grows more real with every envelope that arrives from the South. News filters through, new proposals for a union that will unite the British colonies and former Boer republics into one state. The idea sounds grand and modern when discussed under Oxford's arches. But in the details, in the clauses and sub-clauses, there is one roaring silence. No African voice is invited to the table where the future of their own land is being carved up. Seme feels it like a countdown. If union is formed without his people's participation, the laws that follow will be harder, colder, more permanent. Every exam he passes in Oxford, every lecture he attends in London's Inns of Court, is not just a step toward a law degree, it is a step against that ticking clock. He must finish, qualify, go back, before the cement sets. There is a moment, a twist the story almost took, when he could have stayed. After long nights of study at the Middle Temple in London, after walking those foggy streets where empire's legal heartbeats, offers begin to appear. A position here, an invitation there. Some say, "You are talented, Seme. You could practice in London, make a name for yourself. Life would be easier." Even Arthur, meeting him once in a London cafe, leans back in his chair and says, half teasing, half serious, "You're wasted in the colonies, you know. Stay. You'll never change South Africa. It's built into the soil." For a moment, that soil feels far away. London has gas lamps, libraries, newspapers filled with ideas, rather than just notices of auctions and flogging regulations. Here, he can walk certain streets without anyone stopping him for a pass. The temptation is real. A comfortable life as a clever colonial curiosity in the imperial center, instead of a dangerous life as a troublemaker back home. Then another letter arrives. This one is not polite. It speaks of forced removals, of families pushed off land their ancestors had farmed for generations, now told they are squatters on soil they once defended with spears. It describes African men arrested for failing to produce the correct pass while simply walking to look for work. One sentence stabs more deeply than the rest. They say the new union will be formed soon. We will not be asked anything. They are building a country around us without us. Seme packs his trunk. The voyage back south is different from the one that carried him away. Then he was a boy chasing knowledge. Now he is a man escorting a promise. Somewhere in his luggage, among the legal texts and carefully folded suits, lies the echo of his own words from New York. Africa will be reborn. If he fails, they become a lie. When he steps off the train in Johannesburg, the mining city booming and coughing under a sky stained with smoke, he meets his real opponent face to face. Not a single person this time, but a system made visible. Compounds of black workers fenced in like cattle. White suburbs with neat gardens and strict racial boundaries. Police officers who look a man in the eye and see only a pass number. He opens a small law practice, one of the first black attorneys in the city. Clients arrive with stories that sound like variations of the same nightmare. A widow whose husband died underground. the mine offering a payment so small it is almost an insult. A sharecropper evicted overnight because a white farmer decided the contract was misunderstood. A teacher demoted for daring to question a white inspector. They come in with caps in hand, but the rage under their politeness is volcanic. Seme sits behind his desk, listening, feeling the weight of each case press onto his shoulders. He can win some battles, a delayed payment here, a reversed eviction there, but the pattern is clear. The law he studied is being used as a weapon, and he is trying to defend his people with the blunt edge. In court, he discovers yet another rival, a young white attorney, recently arrived, already trusted by the city's business elite. He knows how to charm judges, how to implicate racism without ever naming it, how to make dispossession sound like contract enforcement. They face each other across the courtroom floor. Seme, in his black robe, the other man with the same uniform but an entirely different relationship to power. When Seme argues, he is asking the law to live up to its own principles. When his rival argues, he is reminding the law whom it truly serves. The judges listen more comfortably to the rival. Sometimes they rule in Seme's favor anyway, because his arguments are too precise to ignore. Those small victories feel sweet, but also bitter. He can see that the real decisions are being made somewhere else, in council chambers and parliaments, where no one who looks like him is allowed to sit. That realization cracks something open. Being a brilliant lawyer will not be enough. Someone has to attack the system at its roots. Across the country, other African leaders are reaching the same conclusion. Local organizations have formed. In the Cape, in Natal, in the Transvaal, each group fighting its own small corner of injustice. They send petitions, hold meetings, draft polite letters begging for fairness. The government nods, files the letters, carries on. It is in this moment that Seme's rivalry takes on a new, more intimate shape. Among the African elite, there is another rising star, a man of education and status, also a lawyer, admired for his moderation. Let us call him Msimang here, embodying a type rather than a single name. Msimang believes in slow progress, in careful negotiation, in reassuring white authorities that Africans want nothing more than to be loyal subjects with slightly better conditions. He and Seme share classrooms, pulpits, platforms. They often share respect, but in private, their arguments cut deep. Pixley, Msimang says one evening after a long meeting in a mission hall, "You are too impatient. You speak of unity, of a national body for all Africans, as if we can simply will it into existence. The chiefs are divided. The educated are suspicious of one another. The churches are jealous. If we push too hard, we will alarm the government and lose what little we have." "What we have," Seme answers quietly, "is being taken from us every season. They are dividing us precisely so we cannot stand together. If we wait, we will soon have nothing left to lose, except our dignity." Their rivalry is not about personal glory. Not yet. It is about strategy, about speed, about how loudly to knock on a door that has never truly been opened. Then comes the shock that ends the debate. In 1910, the Union of South Africa is born. White leaders celebrate, British and Boer hands clasping over the heads of millions of black people who have no vote, no voice, and no place in the new constitution. The newspapers print photographs of smiling ministers in black coats. None of them is African. The message is clear. This is a country for whites to argue with whites about how to manage everyone else. Within 2 years, drafts of a new law begin to circulate. The Natives Land Act. On paper, it sounds technical, administrative, almost dull. In reality, it is a knife. The proposal: reserve less than 1/10 of South Africa's land for the vast African majority, locking them into scattered native reserves, forbidding them to buy or lease land elsewhere. 8% of the land for nearly 80% of the people. The mathematics of dispossession laid out in calm legal language. Seme reads the bill and feels that old pressure in his chest, the same one that drove him through exams in New York and Oxford. The deadline he always feared has taken a new, terrible shape. If this law passes unchallenged, the poverty of his people will not be an accident of history. It will be the officially stamped design of their future. He looks at the scattered organizations, at the mistrust between chiefs and educated elites, at the rivalries and personal grudges over who should lead. He thinks of Msimang's cautious patience. He thinks of Arthur's lazy confidence that nothing truly threatens white control. And he realizes that his real enemy has always been the same: the clock. "We have no more time," he says at a meeting in 1911, his voice echoing off the bare walls of a hall lit by smoky lamps. "We can no longer be a collection of scattered voices. We must become one body, a national congress, a single mouth speaking for all African people." Some in the room are inspired, others are offended. Who is this relatively young lawyer to call for such sweeping unity? Chiefs with ancient lineages feel their authority questioned. Mission-educated men who have led their small regional associations fear losing influence. And in the corner, arms folded, Msimang watches with narrowed eyes. He respects Seme's passion, but he sees the danger too. The more ambitious the plan, the larger the risk of failure and of backlash. The rivalry sharpens. Msimang begins to gather his own circle, men who argue that regional organizations must first be strengthened, that a national body is premature, that Seme's rhetoric is poetry, not politics. Whispers spread. He wants to be a king without a kingdom. Seme, hearing some of these murmurs, feels anger rise, but he forces it into discipline. If he spends his energy defending his own ego, the Land Act will pass before he finishes the sentence. So he does what he has always done best. He works. He travels by train and wagon, from dusty rural districts to cramped townships, meeting chiefs under trees and teachers in mission houses. He uses every skill he learned in American lecture halls and British courts. But now his audience is his own people, and he speaks to them not in the polished tones of Oxford, but in the deep, resonant music of their home languages. He speaks of the map shrinking. He speaks of their children being born into a world where owning land will be a crime. He speaks of a Congress, not of a tribe or a province, but of a nation, African, diverse, united. The response is not uniform. Some chiefs agree, sending delegates and small donations. Others refuse, afraid of angering white magistrates who control their stipends. Once, after a long trip to a distant chiefdom, Seme is turned away at the gate, left standing outside the kraal as the sun sets, dust in his throat, the chief's messenger saying he does not wish to become involved in politics. In those moments, doubt snarls in his mind like a wounded animal. Is Msimang right? Is Arthur right? Is the system so well designed that every attempt to fight it will just lead to punishment, to more laws, to more chains? Then he arrives in another village and finds something else. Old men who have heard of his New York speech, young men who can quote lines from it by heart, women who have walked miles to hear him promise that their children will not have to live forever as tenants on stolen ground. Their eyes are not passive. They are sharp, hungry, alive. That is when the twist happens. Not in a parliament, but in a cramped, crowded meeting in Bloemfontein in early 1912. Representatives from different regions gather, some in suits, some in traditional dress, some with notebooks, some with nothing but memory. The air is thick with tobacco smoke and suspicion. Arguments flare. Should chiefs or educated men lead? Should they petition the king in London or negotiate with the Union government? Should they even risk forming a national body at all? Msimang stands and speaks calmly about moderation, about not provoking a backlash, about small, careful steps. Heads nod. People are tired. They know the state's capacity for violence. Then Seme stands. He does not shout. He has learned that quiet words hit harder. He reminds them that they have already been provoked, that their land is already being taken, their rights already denied, their children already living under a shadow. He speaks of his journey from the cattle fields of Natal to the stone halls of Columbia and Oxford and back again. He tells them what he has seen, that the men who rule do not fear scattered complaints, but they are terrified of something else. Unity. Gentlemen, he says, voice tightening with urgency, we are not forming this Congress in comfort. We are forming it under threat. The laws are coming. The Land Act is coming. If we do not stand together now, by the time we are ready, there will be nothing left to defend. Silence. Then murmurs. Then a shift, almost physical, in the air. Votes are taken. Resolutions drafted. Titles proposed. After years of delay and division, something solid emerges from the smoke and argument. The South African Native National Congress. Not perfect, not fully representative. Not yet. The mighty African National Congress. It will one day become, but it is real. It exists. A national voice where none existed before. Msimang, recognizing the tide, joins rather than standing aside. Their rivalry does not end. It moves inside the same organization, shaping debates, strategies, directions. For public unity, they stand together. In private, they still argue late into the night about methods and priorities. And far beyond the hall, in government buildings, men in suits hear the news and frown. Seme does not become the first president of the Congress. That honor goes to another respected leader, a compromise figure. At first glance, it might seem as if he has lost the contest for power. But look more closely. He is the architect, the one who pushed, cajoled, argued the idea into life. He is its legal brain, its most electrifying voice, the man whose name appears on petitions and letters that now carry the weight of a nation, not just a province. Power in this story is not just a title. It is the ability to shape the stage on which others speak. Outside, the clock keeps ticking. Within a year, the Natives Land Act will pass, carving up South Africa's soil with brutal precision. The Congress will send delegations, petitions, even an appeal to the British Crown. Much of it will be ignored, but something has changed. For the first time, when the state tightens its grip, it does not meet 100 isolated hands. It meets a fist. Pixley Isaka Seme walks out of that Bloemfontein meeting into the harsh sunlight, exhausted, thinner than when he first left Natal, all those years ago, but carrying a different burden now. In New York, he won a medal and startled a room. Here, he has helped to create a weapon, fragile, political, moral, against the empire that raised and trained him. His rival at Oxford, Arthur, will soon help shape laws and policies to contain this new threat. His rival at home, Msimang, will push within the Congress for caution, compromise, careful petitions instead of confrontation. Between them stands Seme, caught again in a race against time, to turn this newborn organization into something powerful enough to protect the people whose stories fill his law office, his memory, his dreams. The boy who once ran barefoot after cattle now runs after laws. The stakes are higher, the deadlines are deadlier, and somewhere inside him, a quiet question begins to whisper, a question that will haunt the next chapter of his life. What happens when the man who helped to build the voice of a nation discovers that even the loudest cry can be swallowed by the silence of power? The answer comes to him not in a burst of inspiration, but in the dull scrape of a ship's hull against a foreign dock. The first time Pixley Isaka Seme understands that even a united African voice can be swallowed, he is standing on a London street. breath turning to mist, waiting outside a door that does not want to open. Behind that door sit men who can change the fate of millions with a sentence. Behind him, across an ocean, families are loading their possessions onto ox wagons because a line of ink, called the Natives' Land Act, has turned their homes into trespass. The Congress he helped to found has sent its best. President John Dube, Seme, and other leaders, suited, polite, carrying carefully written petitions. They have traveled for weeks, through stormed seas, to reach the heart of an empire that has promised justice for all subjects. They have come to ask for time to be turned back, or at least slowed. Look at them in that cold London air. African men in stiff collars, hats clutched in their hands, holding documents that describe dispossession in precise English. They have rehearsed their arguments until their voices cracked. They can quote laws like scripture. Still, the door makes them wait. Inside, the officials are busy. Europe is sliding toward war. The empire has crises to manage. Balkan fireworks, Irish unrest, imperial rivalries. What is a distant law about African land compared to that? When the delegation is finally admitted, the room is politely arranged. Chairs, a polished table, tea, smiles that do not reach the eyes. Seme speaks, his voice carrying the weight of thousands of miles and hundreds of years. He explains how the Land Act will crush African farmers, force them into labor reserves, turn men who once owned cattle into servants who own only debt. He points out the numbers. 7% of the land kept for almost 80% of the population. A legal strangulation, written as if it were mere administration. An official clears his throat. "Gentlemen," he says, "your concerns are noted, but the Union of South Africa now enjoys responsible government. We cannot simply overrule the decisions of a self-governing dominion." Responsible government. Seme hears the phrase like a verdict. The empire that once claimed to be protector has handed the keys to men who see Africans as a problem to be managed, not citizens to be represented. After the meeting, in a corridor that smells of furniture polish and old paper, Seme sees a familiar profile. Arthur. Arthur has changed since Oxford. The student polish has hardened into official confidence. He wears the muted elegance of a man who speaks often in committee rooms. A clerk passes him a file. Arthur signs it without breaking conversation. He looks up, surprised, but not very, to see Seme. "Well," Arthur says, "if it isn't our African champion, I hear you've been very busy." There is no malice in his tone that almost makes it worse. Arthur has been advising, lobbying, whispering in the ears of those who write policy. He speaks the language of stability, of order, of native administration. He couches everything in concern, for investors, for settler farmers, for the delicate balance of race relations. His arguments slide easily into the same ears that just heard Seme's plea. "You should understand," Arthur says mildly, falling into step beside him. "London will not interfere. They've given us the house. They won't start rearranging the furniture because you don't like the curtains." He smiles, as if that settles the matter. For a moment, Seme feels the ground tilt. All his years in American lecture halls, in Oxford libraries, in London courts, all those tools he collected, he has brought them to the very center of power. And here, in its quiet corridors, he discovers something brutal. The clock he has been racing is not even noticed by the men who built it. When war erupts later that year, the final answer arrives. The empire is on fire. South Africa is needed for troops, for horses, for grain. African blood is welcome on European battlefields, but not African voices in European decision rooms. The Land Act remains. The petition is shelved. Seme returns home with a concession so small it feels like an insult. A vague promise of a commission to study native affairs. No repeal, no delay. On the docks, as the ship pulls away from England, he stands at the rail and watches the city blur into mist. Inside, the others sleep restlessly. He does not sleep. He measures the distance between law and power, between justice and interest, in cold, hard miles of ocean. Back in South Africa, the consequences of that distance are already visible. Along dusty roads, long lines of wagons crawl like wounded animals. Families move because they must. On some farms, white landowners wave the Land Act like a weapon, forcing sharecroppers to move, to sign worse contracts, to accept wages that barely keep hunger away. Men who once plowed their own fields now queue at mine compounds, trading their freedom for a number around their neck. In city locations, policemen carry lists and tape measures, checking who is allowed to live where. Every new regulation feels like a tightening belt, each notch cutting deeper. The Congress meets. Speeches are made. Resolutions passed. Delegations sent. But the law has teeth, and it is already biting. Seme throws himself into work with a kind of desperate precision. By day, he is attorney and advocate, drafting appeals, representing those who still have some foothold in the legal system. By night, he is organizer, writing letters by candlelight, calling meetings, dictating petitions to tired typists whose fingers ache from hammering the same phrases. We humbly request, your obedient servants, in the interest of peace. He hears the contradiction in every line. His people are not obedient. They are angry, they are scared, they are proud, but the language the state listens to is the language of deference. So he bends his words into bows and curtsies, even as his thoughts pound against the bars. Msimang stands across the same table watching him. You're exhausted, Msimang says one night, when the ink bottle is almost dry and the lamp is burning low. You can't carry the whole country on your back, Pixley. I'm not carrying it, Seme replies without looking up. I'm trying to stop it being dragged into a hole. Msimang sighs. He believes in petitions too, but his patience is longer. He trusts gradual change. He whispers to Seme that a softer approach will win more allies, that the government must not be frightened into harsher laws. He worries that constant agitation will bring reprisals. You have seen London's face, Seme says quietly. They do not need excuses to ignore us. They do not need provocation. Their silence is already loud. Their rivalry deepens, not because they disagree that their people are suffering, but because they disagree about how much of that suffering to expose, how loudly to cry out. The war ends. Bells ring in Europe. Treaties are signed in grand halls. In South African villages, men return from the front with medals pinned to borrowed jackets and find their families pushed further into reserves, migrant labor more entrenched, the color line drawn darker than before. From the Congress comes a new decision, another delegation, this time to the peace conferences, to ask that the language of self-determination and democracy be applied to Africans too. Seme helps to prepare the case. He knows the script by heart now. Loyalty, service, fairness, the promises of empire. Still, he hopes he has to. But the post-war world has its own priorities. The great powers divide colonies like cards in a smoke-filled room. Mandates, protectorates, trusteeships. Europe redraws Africa's borders without asking Africans a single question. The delegation's words drift like smoke through those chambers, too thin to leave a mark. If there is a victory in these years, it is not on paper. It is in the minds of people who have heard, maybe for the first time, that their suffering is not isolated. In a village in the Eastern Cape, a teacher unfolds a newspaper and reads about petitions sent to London in the name of all Africans. In a mine compound, a worker hears that there is a congress in Bloemfontein that speaks for him too. In a natal mission school, a boy recites lines from The Regeneration of Africa and realizes that someone who looks like him has spoken in New York, in London, and has not bowed. Seme's achievement is not one law reversed. It is a map redrawn in people's heads, a sense that their struggle is not local, not tribal, not small. It is national. But time does not pause to applaud. The 1920s arrive with new storms. Industrial strikes erupt. The mines, those underground kingdoms Arthur's family helped to build, become battlegrounds. The Rand is shaken by strikes, some led by white workers defending their jobs, others by African workers simply demanding to be treated as human beings. New organizations rise, unions, socialist groups, churches with radical preachers. To many, the Congress begins to look old-fashioned, too polite, too careful. Young activists say, petitions are paper, we need action. One of those drawn to these new winds is at times Msimang himself. He attends meetings of unions, listens to fiery speeches about direct resistance, boycotts, mass protests. He does not abandon the Congress, but his attention begins to split. He is pulled between the safety of respectable negotiation and the fire of popular anger. When he and Seme meet now, their arguments are more complicated. You are losing the people, Msimang warns. They look at us in suits and think we are part of the problem. And if we stop wearing suits, Seme asks, weary, will the judges suddenly listen to us more? Will the ministers invite us to their meetings? Respectability is not a costume we wear for ourselves. It is a disguise we use to get close enough to the levers of power to touch them. What if the levers are fake? Msimang counters. What if the real power is in those crowds you only visit when you need signatures? The question hangs between them like a blade. Arthur, meanwhile, has moved from corridors to cabinets. He advises committees on native policy that produce reports with titles like Segregation and Social Harmony. He argues that Africans should be given development, but always under white supervision, always at a controlled pace, always in areas carefully set aside. He pushes for laws that separate black and white urban spaces, framing segregation as kindness, as a way to prevent friction. He never shouts. He never uses crude language. He convinces by sounding reasonable. In minutes of meetings, his words look like concern. On the ground, they become police batons and pass raids. By the late 1920s, Congress itself is fraying. Funds are scarce. Some branches are little more than names on faded letterheads. Petitions go unanswered more often than not. Younger leaders whisper that the organization needs new blood, new energy. Others say it needs discipline, a stronger central hand to pull the scattered pieces together. Into this tension steps Seme again, but this time not as the fiery young outsider forcing an idea into existence. This time he steps forward as a candidate for the very top. It is a twist almost nobody predicted back in that smoky Bloemfontein Hall in 1912. Then he was the architect whose plans were too radical for some, too ambitious for others. He was the man who pushed from behind. Now, as the 1930s dawn, he stands for the presidency of the organization he helped to create. The race is not just about votes, it is about direction. One camp wants a president who will keep Congress respectable, focused on petitions and delegations, careful not to invite outright bans. Another wants a president who will turn Congress into something closer to a mass movement, willing to organize boycotts, strikes, acts of civil disobedience. Seme is caught between these poles. He knows the language of the courtroom and the language of the street. He fears that if Congress becomes too radical too quickly, it will be crushed. He fears just as much that if it remains too polite, it will fade into irrelevance. Msimang is there, of course, in the background of every conversation. Sometimes he stands against Seme, sometimes beside him. Sometimes he criticizes Seme's caution. Sometimes he warns others that Seme is the only one with enough stature to keep Congress from falling apart completely. Their rivalry has become a strange braid of respect, resentment, and shared history. When the votes are counted, Pixley Isaka Seme becomes president. At last, he holds the title many assumed he already had, President of the African National Body. The boy from the cattle fields now sits at the head of a table where the nation's strategy is decided. It should feel like a victory. In some ways, it does. He walks into meetings, and people stand. Newspapers print his name with honorifics. Chiefs and ministers, pastors and teachers address him as Mr. President. But there is a catch. He has finally reached the summit at the very moment the mountain itself is shaking. The state is tightening its machinery. New proposals appear. To remove the last African voters in the Cape from the common roll, to lock land control even more firmly in white hands, to formalize segregation in every sphere. Bills are drafted with clinical names and deadly implications. Arthur's fingerprints are on some of the memoranda that precede them. The logic is familiar. Order, stability, separate development. He now belongs to a class of men who see African political organization, even in its most moderate form, as a nuisance to be managed, or a threat to be neutralized. At the same time, inside Congress, not everyone welcomes Seme's leadership style. He believes in central authority. He pushes for a stronger constitution that gives the president and the national executive more control over branches, hoping to stop the organization from splintering into local fiefdoms. He introduces membership schemes, tries to regularize dues, wants every delegate properly accredited. To some, this is necessary discipline. To others, it feels like suffocation. Whispers begin. He is autocratic. He does not listen. He treats Congress like his law office, not a movement. At meetings, younger men challenge him, speaking more bluntly than anyone would have dared in 1912. They talk of worker struggles, of urban poverty, of partnerships with trade unions and communists. They accuse the old guard of being stuck in the era of petitions, while the world is moving toward mass politics. Seme hears them and feels a double sting. On one side, the state is preparing to push Africans further out of the political system altogether. On the other, his own house is restless, impatient, suspicious of the very discipline he believes they need to survive the coming storm. The time limit is no longer just the next law, the next commission, the next deputation. It is personal. He is aging. The years of overwork are written in the lines on his face, in the way he rubs his temples after long meetings. He knows he does not have infinite time to shape the Congress into a weapon sharp enough to matter. He knows that if he fails now, the generation coming after him will inherit not a tool, but a relic. In cabinet rooms, men like Arthur count votes and plan how to remove Africans from any meaningful say in national affairs. In church halls, men like Musimang argue about whether to work through the system or to create parallel structures, conventions that speak for the people when Parliament refuses to. In between, carrying the weight of both worlds, stands Seme. He drafts statements against proposed bills, writes telegrams to allies, considers joint platforms with other African bodies. He knows that if they do not present a united front, the government will divide them, offering minor concessions to some while crushing others. He is still chasing time, still racing that invisible clock. And as the 1930s deepen, with new economic crises, new laws, new resistance, a new question begins to stalk him in the quiet hours. When the meetings are over and the candles burn low, what if, after everything, the speeches in New York, the studies in Oxford, the petitions in London, the birth of the Congress, the years at the bar, the presidency at last, what if the system he has spent his life trying to bend refuses to move at all? What happens to a man whose greatest achievement is to give his people a voice and then discover that the world has learned how to live with their cries? The harshest silence a man can hear is not from his enemies, but from a room full of people who once cheered his name. Years ago, They had stood to applaud the young lawyer who dared to imagine a united African nation. Now, in a crowded hall that smells of sweat and dust and damp felt hats, many of those same men lean together, whispering, avoiding. His eyes, as if his gaze were a searchlight. On the wall hangs a clock. Its hands crawl toward a decision. Outside Parliament, white ministers are preparing the bills that will rip the last African voters from the common roll, locking power behind a door that will not open again in his lifetime. Inside this hall, the Congress that Pixley Isaka Seme helped to build is debating whether he should remain its president. The double race is brutal. The nation has only months before new laws slam shut, and Seme has only minutes before the vote is called. He sits at the head of the table, papers squared in front of him, every gesture controlled. The gavel in his hand feels heavier than it did on the day he first took the chair. His voice, when he speaks, is measured, careful, almost too calm. Brothers, he says, we stand at the edge of a cliff. The Representation of Natives Bill will come before the House within the year. If we fracture now, we arrive at that fight already broken. A delegate from the Cape stands up, fists clenched at his sides. With respect, Mr. President, he answers, we are already broken. Branches do not hear from the center for months. Funds disappear into reports no one sees. When workers strike, we issue polite statements instead of standing beside them. The people ask, where is the Congress? And they do not see you. They do not see us. There are murmurs of agreement. The clock ticks. Seme feels a heat rising under his collar, but he keeps his face composed. He wants to tell them about the nights he spent drafting responses, the coins he put from his own pocket into the organization's empty accounts, the letters he wrote that were never answered. He wants to shout that chaos is not courage, that discipline is not betrayal. Instead, he says quietly, you want a Congress that shouts louder. I want a Congress that lives long enough to outshout the laws. If they ban us, if they seize our records, if they jail our leaders, then who will be left to speak? From the back of the hall, another voice cuts in. It is one he knows too well. Msimang. Maybe the real question, Msimang says, is who is speaking now? Is it the people, or is it just you? The words are not shouted. That makes them worse. Eyes swing between them like a pendulum. Their rivalry, born in late-night arguments over tactics and tone, has ripened into something harder. Msimang has been traveling, listening, watching the new militancy in the streets, the workers ready to march, the students reading about revolutions abroad. To him, Seme's insistence on petitions and protocol looks less like strategy and more like fear. We do not ask for you to be perfect, Msimang continues, but we ask you to listen. We ask you to share control. You hoard it. You centralize everything. You treat Congress like a brief you must argue alone. Seme wants to say, because I remember what happens when we are divided. I watched London ignore us once. They will not hesitate to do so again. He wants to say, I am racing a clock you refuse to see. But pride, that old ally and enemy, sits in his throat. If you believe, he replies, that this organization can be steered by committee shouting, then say so. If you believe it needs no firm hand, then say that. But do not forget whose name was signed on the first constitution you carry in your pocket. It is a misstep. Appealing to history in a room haunted by the present sounds like a plea from a man who has only the past to offer. The vote is called. Hands rise, some hesitantly, some with painful swiftness. A few remain in their laps, fingers twisting nervously, unwilling to choose. The result is not a landslide, but it is clear. The presidency slips from his grasp, not with a dramatic shout, but with the soft scrape of chairs as men stand to congratulate someone else. He does not storm out. He nods, even manages a thin smile, offers formal congratulations to the new president. Later, people will say he was dignified, that he accepted the will of the organization like a true Democrat. They will not see the moment later that night when he sits alone in a boarding house room, tie loosened, looking at his hands as if expecting to find them suddenly empty. For years, he has carried the Congress like a fragile bundle pressed against his chest. Now it has been taken from him by people he helped to teach how to lift it. Outside, the national clock keeps ticking. When the Representation of Natives Act becomes law, it happens in a polished chamber with polished phrases. Seme is not there. Members of Parliament talk of adjustments and reforms, while in reality they are wiping names off the roll as easily as chalk off a board. More than 10,000 African voters in the Cape, men who had believed stubbornly that property and education might shield them, are told that their voices will now be channeled through distant white representatives on a separate list. Imagine it, a whole section of a nation moved, on paper, from citizen to ward in a single afternoon. No gunshots, no sirens, just the soft rustle of pages turning, the scratch of a pen, and the quiet click as a new lock slides into place. From his law office, Seme reads the reports. Each sentence feels like a personal failure. The strategy he chose, the careful arguments, the appeals to fairness, the insistence on staying within the system, has not slowed the machine. It has only given it more time to learn his rhythms. He throws himself back into legal work. If he cannot shift the country with petitions, he will at least shield individual people with contracts and cases. He represents farmers trying to keep their last hectares, laborers cheated of wages, families tangled in succession disputes sharpened by new land laws. There are victories, a judgment in favor of a widow, a stay of eviction for a village that buys a few more years on unwanted earth. Each win feels like bailing water from a sinking ship with a teacup, but he keeps dipping, keeps throwing. One afternoon, he is summoned to a government building in Pretoria for a routine matter involving a client and a mining company. The corridors smell of floor polish and cigarette smoke. As he waits, he hears a familiar laughter drifting from an open door. Arthur, his old rival, steps out, hair now silver at the temples, suit cut with the quiet perfection of an established man. The years have been kinder to him. He has sat on commissions, helped draft native policies, watched his recommendations turn into regulations, and then into the quiet misery of millions. "Pixley," he says, as if greeting an old friend at a club, "I heard you step down. Or was it pushed?" The jab is light, almost playful. That makes it cut deeper. Seme studies him. Once, they were two young men arguing in Oxford courtyards about the future of a country neither fully understood. Now, they are two older men who know exactly what has been done to that country. One as an architect, the other as an obstruction. "You must be satisfied," Seme replies. "Your house is in order. Voters removed, land fenced, passes tightened. What more could a responsible government wish for?" Arthur's smile flickers. For all his confidence, there are cracks. "You talk as if we enjoy this," he says. "We are trying to manage a volatile situation. Segregation is necessary. Without it, there will be chaos. Blood. There is blood," Seme says softly. "You just do not see it, because it seeps into the soil, not onto your carpets." For a moment, the old intimacy surfaces. Arthur's eyes rest on him. Something like regret moving there, or perhaps just discomfort at seeing a man he once respected, now standing on the other side of history. "Time changes things, Pixley," Arthur says at last. "You must change with it." "I have been chasing time my whole life," Seme answers. "You have been building the cage it runs in." They part with polite words and cold shoulders, two trajectories crossing for what may be the last time. As the 1930s bleed into the 1940s, the world convulses again. War erupts in Europe. South Africa mobilizes. African men are recruited as drivers, laborers, soldiers. They carry stretchers in North Africa, build roads in East Africa, guard bases and depots. They wear uniforms, salute flags, obey orders shouted in English and Afrikaans. They are good enough to die for the empire, but still not good enough to vote alongside the men they rescue. From his office and from rural KZN, where he increasingly spends time advising the Zulu royal house, Seme watches. He sees an old pattern repeating: African loyalty traded for promises that dissolve once the guns fall silent. He drafts careful memoranda for chiefs and councillors, explaining new regulations, warning them of clauses buried deep in legal language that will strip them of authority while pretending to recognize it. In these years, his influence shifts. He is no longer the public tribune at the front of Congress meetings. Instead, he becomes the quiet strategist behind closed doors, the one who can read the law like a map and point out where the traps lie. It is not the kind of glory that fills song, but it keeps some fires from being stamped out completely. And then, a twist that no one could script. In Johannesburg, a young law clerk from the countryside walks past his office door and slows, staring at the brass plate. P.K. Isaka Seme, attorney. The clerk has heard that name before, whispered with respect in rural homesteads, mentioned in mission school classrooms as proof that an African can argue in white courts and not flinch. He is ambitious, impatient, carrying his own dreams of a free country like a secret flame. His name is Nelson. There is no grand meeting, no formal blessing. Maybe they exchange only a few words in a corridor. Perhaps Seme, tired from a morning in court, barely registers the encounter. But the young man sees him, the neat suit, the controlled stride, the quiet dignity of someone who insisted decades earlier that Africans must speak for themselves. Years later, when that young man stands in dock and says he is prepared to die for an ideal, part of the path that brought him there traces back through that brass plate, that office, that idea, a national organization, a united struggle. Seme does not live to see the climax. He only feels the tremors as the ground shifts. In 1948, a new word hardens the air: apartheid. What had been practice becomes policy, shameless and explicit. Laws pour out of Parliament like cement. Population registration, group areas, suppression of communism, each one another layer in the wall around his people. He reads the newspapers with a tightening chest. The language is familiar: order, harmony, separate development. But the brazenness still shocks him. All the soft phrases that men like Arthur used to cushion segregation are stripped away. The truth stands naked. This is not about managing difference. It is about permanent domination. By now, Seme's health is failing. Years of overwork and stress have etched themselves into his body. A doctor, after listening to his heart and pressing fingers into his swollen ankles, tells him gently to rest. Rest? He thinks. When? There is a new clock now, ticking inside his ribs. He counts the years like beads on a string. Born around 1881, he has already outlived the expectations placed on a rural boy who once herded cattle under Zulu skies. But he feels the nearness of the end. He knows he will not see the system he has fought collapse. The most he can hope for is to position those who will continue the struggle after him. He writes letters to younger leaders, to chiefs, to former colleagues in Congress. Some reply with warmth, others with the polite distance reserved for a figure whose time is seen as past. Movements are shifting toward mass defiance, toward stayaways and strikes, toward alliances with workers' organizations and new ideologies. In quiet moments, the doubts creep in. Was he too cautious? Did his insistence on respectability blunt the edge of resistance? Did he spend too much time in courtrooms and too little in township streets? Yet another voice answers from somewhere deeper. Without the idea of a national body, there would be no platform for mass struggle to stand on. Without the fragile threads he and others spun across provinces and ethnic lines, later leaders would have had to invent unity from nothing. His rivalry with Msimang softens in those years. They are both older now, both bearing scars from battles won and lost, both watching a new generation pick up their tools and hammer them into different shapes. They still disagree about tactics, but something gentler sits between them. The recognition that time is now their common enemy. "We argued for 30 years, Seme says once, with a faint smile. "Perhaps history will decide which of us was right. Or perhaps," Msimang replies, "it will decide we were both necessary." In 1951, as the government pushes further with the Bantu Authorities Act, turning traditional leadership into a bureaucratic arm of apartheid, Seme feels the last stretch of his race. He has spent his final years advising the Zulu monarchy, trying to help it navigate between collaboration and total marginalization, urging it to hold fast to some measure of dignity and independence within a system designed to hollow it out. One evening, he returns from a meeting, shoulders stooped, hat held loosely in his hand. The sky is a deep, bruised purple, the kind that comes just before full darkness. He pauses on a hill above the valley, looking down at the clustered huts, the thin lines of paths, the tiny dots of people, moving like slow currents. So much has changed since the days when he left for America, with a head full of impossible dreams. Railways now cut across farms, mines gouge the earth, cities pull young people away from the land into concrete cages. Yet in the evening, smoke rising from cooking fires, in the murmur of voices carrying through the air, he hears something stubborn and ancient, a people not yet crushed. He thinks of Arthur, perhaps sitting in a paneled dining room somewhere, sipping brandy, convinced that the system they have built will last for generations. He thinks of Msimang, attending yet another meeting, arguing for unity. He thinks of that young clerk in Johannesburg, and all those like him, restless, impatient, unwilling to live and die within the lines someone else has drawn. He realizes that the clock he has been racing was never meant for one lifetime. The next day, or the one after, the exact hour will blur in memory. His heart finally insists on its own time. Pixley Isaka Seme dies, not in a blaze of headlines, but in the quiet way most lives end. A breath that does not return. A room filling with the sudden weight of absence. Newspapers mark his passing with respectful obituaries. They call him a pioneer, a founder, a distinguished native advocate. Some mention his early speech in America, his role in the birth of the African National Congress. Few dwell on the years of disappointment, the sleepless nights over petitions ignored, the personal toll of carrying a dream larger than one body can bear. But history is not written in obituaries. It is written in what people do after you are gone. 4 years later, in 1955, thousands of delegates will gather in Kliptown to adopt the Freedom Charter, a bold document that declares South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white. Many of those who raise their hands in agreement will have grown up in a world where the idea of a national African organization was already normal, as obvious as the sunrise. They will not remember a time before that idea existed, but that does not mean there was no such time. The man who stood in American halls and dared to speak of a regeneration of Africa, the man who stitched together chiefs and teachers, dock workers and clerks into a Congress when the word itself sounded absurd, the man who lost his presidency to the very democracy he created. His fingerprints are on that charter, on the organization that leads the struggle, on the very language of a united people. Arthur's memoranda will yellow in archives. The laws he helped draft will one day be repealed, their names remembered mostly as curses in history lessons. Msimang's speeches will echo in union halls and political schools, and the boy from the cattle fields who raced the clock, who discovered that the system could live with his people's cries and still did not stop shouting. His legacy will live in every voice that refuses to be quiet. In the end, the twist is this. Pixley Isaka Seme does not win the battle he can see. He does not live to witness the walls crack, the statues fall, the flag change. His victory lies elsewhere, in the fact that long after his heart stops, the nation he imagined refuses to die.